it's like unbelievable. And it's like 2023 and that still exists. Hi, everyone. Sorry, midstream, mid thought. This is Melanie, co host of Red Power Hour. Elena and I are back for one of our regular episodes. Hi, Elena.
Hello. We were just ranting a little bit.
Yeah, this is going to be another RPH episode where we're ranting about museums, actually, museums and public history today. And how in 2023 it's apparently still acceptable to represent Native people as either completely like extinct. It's kind of like extinct, or it's kind of like a objects, archaeological and anthropological objects. I don't
Yeah.
know. I thought it was like not cool to do that anymore, but apparently it is. But before we get into the rant, just wanted to let everyone know that we recorded a kick-ass episode where we broke down kind of like the indigenous commentary on colonialism that we saw in The Mandalorian, season 3 of The Mandalorian. That is behind the paywall. So if you're interested in hearing what we have to say about Star Wars and The Mandalorian, please consider joining our Patreon. You can join for $2 and up. So go ahead and visit Red Media's page on patreon.com and consider joining so you can hear some of that bonus content from me and Elena, but also from there's so many people who contribute to the podcast now. We have new podcasts that are part of the Red Media family. We're doing interviews with people who are doing incredible work on the ground. So yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff behind the paywall. And as I've said in the past many times, any amount that you give us on Patreon goes directly to paying a group of young Indigenous creatives who make the podcast happen and so much more of what we do with Red Media. So now that I did the pitch, let's get into it. Museums, are they cool or are they whack?
And they're pretty whack. So I just got back from Chicago. I spent a week in Chicago, and the first thing I did when I got there was to go to the Field Museum, which is considered one of the finest natural history museums in the world. And it's huge, and you walk up the steps and it's got the Greek columns, and you just feel like you're walking into an important building. And I wanted to go specifically by myself when I first got there because I have a number of friends who worked on the new Native Voices exhibit that opened up a few months back or last year at the Field Museum. And so I wanted to go and see that, and I wanted to have time to wander through. And parts of it were cool, and parts of it were whack. And I left that exhibit feeling the same way I felt for years about museums, which is we're still, as Native people, we're still relegated to this realm of natural history, like the dinosaurs, right? The Native Voices exhibit is on the same side of the Field Museum as the dinosaur exhibit. And try as they might, even though this was curated by a lot of Native people, and I'm probably going to get in a lot of trouble for saying this, and a lot of Native people have degrees in museum studies. And, that is a very viable educational path for a lot of Native people, particularly in areas where there's a lot of Native population, like, Institute of American Indian Arts has a museum studies degree. And I still have problems with Native exhibits in museums that are not owned and run by Native people. Like, I have been to the Diné Nation Museum in Window Rock, and I think that's a great museum. I've been to other Native museums, which I think, the Pueblo Cultural Center is a good museum, has a good museum. But this exhibit, there was some cool parts of it. There was, when you first walk in, well, they had the logo that said you were on Native land that came from urban Native era. So that was cool. That was the first thing I saw. So that was cool. Then I walked in, and there was a room off to the left with this. Yeah, and I apologize, I don't remember what nation he was from, but a young man who was a poet, slam poet, and also a skateboarder and an artist, and had a lot of the things that he had done, very contemporary, very young, youth stuff. And one of the cases was just him talking about the racism that he had to endure in one of the local hospitals. And that to me felt real and relevant. And then you walk to the back, a lot of it is about arts and crafts. Like, museums like to show clothing, particularly if it's beaded, pottery, things like that. And then there was a little exhibit sort of in a semi-enclosed room in the center, and it was all about Chaco and Chaco Canyon. And Deb Holland, who has been photographed widely by the press, coming out to Chaco Canyon and talking about needing to have protections in place for the area. And I know Red Nation and a lot of our comrades in Red Nation have been fighting the good fight on this for years. But that's not who they interviewed. That's not whose voice is in this exhibit. And the voice in the exhibit is someone who helped curate the exhibit. They have a big picture of one of the actions that Red Nation participated in at the Bureau of Land Management building in Santa Fe. And I was there. A lot of our Red Nation comrades were there. And there's this big photograph of folks that I knew holding up a banner. And that's not whose voices you heard. So you didn't hear the voices from the people who were actually fighting the fight. You heard the voice of someone who's not participated in any of those actions on a street level, on an actual action level. And that just I was shaking my head.
Yeah, I was talking about, because you shared the photo with Demetrius, our comrade Demetrius, because Demetrius is featured in the photo, and then Demetrius shared it with me. And I think Demetrius shared it with everyone in the Red Nation. And we're like, hey, we remember that action. And the photo, we talked a lot about that photo and what was happening when that photo was taken. And that was in 2018, wasn't it? An action in 2018? Because there was more than one action that Red Nation participated in regarding Chaco in 2018. Correct?
Yeah, I think there was only one at that BLM headquarters.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. Was that the one where we took the intersection? Was that the BLM headquarters over by IAIA in Santa Fe?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yep. Okay. So the reason why I'm saying this is that all of the people pictured in the photo, we were thinking wow, that was one of those campaigns where we were in true coalition. We were in coalition with people that it's kind of an unlikely coalition, very grassroots. So there was tribal council delegates from the affected communities, Navajo communities that are adjacent to Chaco, Pueblo Action Alliance. There was the Red Nation. There were community people from the chapters, the Diné chapters and the Navajo Nation that are close to Chaco. And so it was really a representation of collaboration, probably something akin to what was done around Bears Ears that was happening around the same time or a little bit earlier, where tribal nations were actually working with indigenous grassroots organizations and groups to advance a particular campaign. And I mean, that coalition doesn't really exist anymore. Coalitions come and go. And a lot of the work to protect Chaco has been taken over by very wealthy environmental NGOs, which is really sad because I feel like they kind of gutted the community-oriented aspect of the work. But the reason why I'm saying this is because, for that picture, we know because we were there. And I mean, I didn't do a lot of the work on Chaco. Actually, it was Cheyenne Antonio who's
Yeah.
like one of our Diné sisters, one of the original members of the Red Nation, actually, who's from a community that is deeply affected by the oil and gas development that they're trying to protect Chaco from. And Shai has just been such a trailblazer in that movement, has faced intense discrimination for being Diné and for being a woman, honestly, a young woman doing that work. And she's still in the Red Nation, still going hard. And so we understand that history from the inside of it, having been there, and even just evaluating that picture. And so it's interesting that the picture is in this like famous history museum, and there are people who are looking at it who have no concept whatsoever, really, of what that anti-colonial kind of like the Diné feminist history is about that particular moment. And then it's narrated by a Pueblo man who, from what I remember, was never at any single action during that period, to protect Chaco. And so what you create is like a false narrative. You're creating something that's false, and you're not actually narrating history correctly. And you're certainly not narrating like politics correctly, because right? And so what happens like in museums, for example, or what happens with monuments, other edifices, I guess, of public history. I've seen this happen a lot actually with the Red Nation. People like literally get the history wrong, but they also depoliticize and really whitewash the work that we've done, and it's incredibly disturbing. Like, you shouldn't have like a conservative Pueblo man narrating an exhibit that features a photo of a movement that was led by like radical young Diné and Pueblo women.
and it's a bait and switch, really.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was just about the importance of Chaco to Pueblo people, or to one specific community, because Chaco means different things
Mm-hmm.
to different people. So if it was just a narrative that said, I am from this community and this is how my community feels about this place and why we need to protect it, that would have been okay. But this exhibit featured Deb Holland and her going to Chaco and really standing on the shoulders of Cheyenne Antonio and people like her, who have been fighting for the protection of the canyon and the protection of the people around the canyon who live there, whose health is being affected by the fracking and the extractive industries. So you had two different thematic presences there. One about the spiritual importance of Chaco to this one particular community, and the other about the importance of protecting it, not just for its historic value, but for the fact that it's creating health issues. And there was no clear separation. You had this voiceover, and like Melanie said, that individual was not part of the coalition that was there that day when that picture was taken. And no one, probably but me, at least that day, had any clue of that. And that bothered me,
Mm-hmm.
because it was a false narrative, and it was disappointing that it was whitewashed, it was depoliticized, and it feeds into this narrative of Native spirituality.
Yep.
And centering Native spirituality when our comrades are fighting for the very health and safety of our relatives. And it's not necessarily a spiritual action. It's an action of protection. And so, yeah, it really bothered me.
Right. That coalition to establish that boundary, that buffer around Chaco, so that fracking couldn't get closer. I mean, yes, it's about cultural preservation to an extent, but it's about the material conditions that resource extraction creates in those communities that are adjacent to those fracking fields. And those material conditions are like you said, really poor health, high rates of cancer, high rates of asthma, right? Like poverty. And it has also created economically intense conflict within families, some of whom have allotments where they're able to make money from oil and gas development on their little parcels of land, and those who don't have allotments, right? And so it's creating divisions in the community about money and people being able to make money off of oil and gas. I mean, the Navajo Nation Council just, was it last week or the week before, doubled down on supporting allottees in that area and vehemently came out against any type of buffer around Chaco, which was a real blow, I think, to the work we were doing. And by we, I mean, not really me, like I wasn't central to the Chaco work in that coalition. Again, it's really mostly Cheyenne and Red Nation supporting. But like the work that we were doing 5 years ago around this issue. And so the oil and gas development has also exacerbated like divisions within the community, when of course like the values that underlie being a Diné person are about kinship, right? It's about being a good relative. It's about working in balance and harmony with other people and with the land. And so resource extraction has like destroyed the material conditions for just like thriving and well-being for Indigenous people who live close, who are primarily my people, Diné people, who live close to Chaco Canyon. That's what that coalition is about.
Yep.
You know? They should have a voiceover explaining that.
Yeah, they definitely should. They threw that picture in there, which was just interesting. And then very little explanation, very little narrative around that, other than, you know, there have been protests for the protection of Chaco, but no explanation as to who they were or why. Just very interesting. A lot of pictures of the ancestral communities around Chaco. Not a lot of talk about the Diné people who are living there and living through, the largest methane cloud in North America is hanging over the Four Corners area. Yeah. So, yeah.
So like, I mean, I don't know who curated that exhibit. You're saying it's some Native people, some Native professionals helped, like advised or whatever.
Yep.
Okay. So why would you choose that photo? Because people know who the Red Nation is. A lot of people don't like the Red Nation. A lot of like petty bourgeois Native people do not like the Red Nation in New Mexico. And so it's like, you have all these photos you could possibly choose from to represent that struggle. So why did you pick that photo? And then why did you like not tell the truth?
Yeah.
No. Like, why not contact from somebody from like the Red Nation to provide a voiceover? I have a PhD.
Yeah.
I'm a trained historian.
Yeah.
Like, so is Nick Estes, for example.
Yep. It's true. Well, there are darlings of the museum world and people who are the chosen voices, which is literally doing the same thing to Native exhibits in museums as historians have done all along, which is, choose one narrative and use that one and ignore the rest. And so we've just shifted from having our stories told by white men with PhDs in history to, I might get in trouble for this, to Native men who have, a vested interest in the narrative and in keeping control of that narrative. And nowhere, was there any mention of the fact that women really started the protests and the actions around protection of Chaco. And that women, well, we all know the women have been at the forefront of most of these major actions in the last, at least 20 years, Standing Rock. But certainly in New Mexico, the Saving Chaco, Protecting Chaco, and also water protectors and land defenders all over the Southwest. They predominantly are women. But that's not talked about because we have these men's voices in these voiceovers. And then the rest of the exhibit, there was some interesting stuff. There was folks talking about language preservation and language retention, and then there was some other like I said, a lot of arts and crafts, and stuff that I would say is typically present in exhibits about Native people. In almost every museum I've ever gone to that's not Native run, that's what you get. And then in the very back, they had a big monitor, and they were showing Res Dogs, a clip from Res Dogs. So there were some parts of it that I thought were pretty well done, and then some parts of it I thought were just like business as usual. And here we are in this natural history museum on the same side as the dinosaurs. And then the next day, or a few days later, I had to go back with the group I was with, and I was walking on the same side of the museum, and I was headed for the cafe to get a drink. And as I'm walking along, all of a sudden I look up and I see on the right-hand side, there's this video. And then I see Melanie's face, and I was like, what? Like, there's all these people I know all of a sudden showing up in this museum. And it was the entrance, like in the main hall of the Field Museum, on the lake side. So the same side as the cafe. There's an entrance to the hall that's called Ancient Americans. And there's this video on loop, and it's a bunch of Native people who I think are saying hello in their languages. And so I stood there because I had to see it loop around again so I could get a video of it. And like, I knew a bunch of the people who were speaking. And so then I thought, okay, I took the video because I had to show it to Melanie. And then I was like, well, since I'm here, I might as well just go into the exhibit. And that was literally the exact same thing I have seen at every natural history museum across the country, which is, you've got your Mayans, you got your Aztecs, you got your Incas, you got your pictures, and, a bunch of white people talking about why, pyramids were built like that. And it was like, God. Why are we still relegated to museums of natural history? Why are we still treated, like you said, like we're extinct and like, that's just the surface of the representation of Native people. We're not even talking about the millions and millions of things that were stolen from Native people. When you're talking like Native voices, you're on Native land. That was the big sign that you see when you're going into this exhibit. No one talks about how half of the stuff that they excavated from the Four Corners area from my ancestors, from my ancestral communities, was shipped to Scandinavia. No one talks about the skeletal remains of people, of our ancestors, of our relatives that are locked in the basement of multiple museums across the country. There's an incredible amount of harm that was done by museums, and there's like this much harm reduction work being done right now. Like there was some signs that in both of those exhibits that things had been removed because of their sensitive nature and because they were possible NAGPRA. They didn't say NAGPRA, but possible provenance issues. And so what they're basically saying is, oh shit, we put something out for public display and somebody came and saw it and said, you stole this from my people. Now you need to give it back. Like, so even though they're acknowledging, like they could have just taken out these cases, they didn't. They put an acknowledgement in there that is supposed to be some sort of harm reduction. But really, you can't even imagine what these museums have in the basement. And, it's come out a little bit over the last, 30 years since NAGPRA was passed, about how many things these museums, and particularly the ones associated with Ivy League schools, Harvard and Princeton and Brown. I mean, they have stuff that I can't, that it scares me to think about.
Didn't we talk? There was a story that came out, was maybe like August of last year or like early fall. Someone was cleaning out like the anthropology department at Harvard, and they found all of these hair samples.
Yep, from kids.
From kids, like 300. It was like a lot of hair samples. And they interviewed like all of the native people that they could find at Harvard. I'm laughing because it's so absurd. They interviewed the native people at Harvard, including staff and students and faculty, to I guess they consulted them to be like, what should we do with this? But they were also like, hey, this person has the same last name as you. There's like a Yazzie, for example, in the sample. They're like, is this person your relative? And it's like, there's actually like laws about how you go about returning these items where they belong. Like maybe you shouldn't be like traumatizing native people who work for you by just bringing them into some sort of informal meeting and asking them if like this stolen hair belongs to one of their relatives. Like you're Harvard, you own the world, like you have billions of dollars.
Yep.
To handle this correctly. And so anyway, that's reminding me of that. That was happening last year. But going back to the video of me, so you shared the video with me, and I was like, oh my God, wow, I don't ever remember doing this. Like this, I don't know, where does this video exist? And I was like, where was this taken? And I was like, oh, I did a Navajo language class at the Institute of American Indian Arts. So I was an employee at the time at IAIA in the like continuing education, like community outreach portion of IAIA. And I decided to take, because employees could take classes for free or like reduced tuition. I don't remember, but I wanted to take a Navajo language class. So I think that was in 2007 was when that video was taken. Again, I don't remember ever recording that. But it was also, again, they identified me correctly, right? My name is Melanie K. Yazzie, but as also like, shouldn't you ask me permission to use my image, especially if it's like in the main hall of the field museum? And I don't know why this video is at the entrance to ancient history or whatever, because that was from 2007.
Yep.
For some people, 2007 might be ancient history, but it's not. I don't know. The whole thing is just so bizarre.
It was bizarre. And as I was watching, because I watched the thing loop around a couple of times just to make sure that I got the video, and yours was the only one that didn't look intentional. Like the rest of them, you could tell they were up against green screens or they were placed somewhere.
They were recorded specifically for that video.
Specifically for this. And as I was watching, I was like, damn, that was a long time ago, because I mean, I've known you for almost 10 years, and I know. And I was like, damn, I think this is a younger Melanie. And if it was 2007, yeah. And it just was so weird. It was like, I wonder if I said the same thing about the picture with D in it. I was like, I wonder if they know it's here. And that's why, I posted it and I tagged him. I was like, you're all famous now. And then I realized, wait a minute, I wonder if he even knows that's there. And there's no consent. Like, that's the other thing about it, which really freaks me out, is that people think they can just take pictures or videos of Native people and like put them in a museum with no permission, no consent. I mean, what is that about? Like, are we so dehumanized that like just being Native makes us public property?
Property?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So, all right, right. I think we're onto something. This idea, especially, is perpetuated in museums. It's perpetuated in like the monuments that we helped tear down in 2020 that they're trying to put back up. But this notion that Native people are public property, or that we're just objects, right? Or that we
Yeah.
can be represented through objects. Like, this is a very prevalent form of representation in museums. And the first, so going back to 2009, I was a first year PhD student at UNM in American Studies. And the very first graduate paper that I ever wrote that I was proud of was about museums. I was in one of Gerald Visner's seminars. He was still in the department at that time, famed Gerald Visner. And so I used his concept, his very famous concept of survivance, to kind of analyze what I saw at 3 different museums in New Mexico. So I went to permanent exhibits at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, which you referenced earlier, the Albuquerque Museum, which is in downtown or Old Town Albuquerque, and then the New Mexico History Museum, which is in downtown Santa Fe. And the New Mexico History Museum in 2009 was very new. I think it had only been up for maybe a few years. And so that being a very new museum, means that it was like cutting edge, right? In terms of like the politics behind how they were narrating history. And I had no preconceived notions. I wasn't even really that politicized in 2009, to be honest with you. I was just trying to like, get an A in my graduate seminar. So I just took the time and I went through these permanent exhibits and, took some notes, and I wrote up like how they narrated New Mexico history differently. And it was really sad to realize that like actually the non-native, meaning the Indigenous Pueblo Cultural Center, was quite beautiful, actually, the way that it narrated New Mexico history from a Pueblo perspective. It was very much about survivance. It was about the strength and the resilience of Pueblo people. It was about how colonialism brought violence, but that Pueblo people persisted, right? Even in the face of colonialism, and still maintain their identity and their strength as Indigenous people today. And so it was a very affirming, right? A very affirming, there was a lot of art by Pueblo people in the exhibit. It was very much like a Pueblo worldview, kind of. It was done from a Pueblo or Indigenous worldview perspective. And then the Albuquerque Museum, the permanent exhibit, like the only representation of Indigenous people was through this like maybe early 19th or late 19th century squash blossom, or maybe early 20th century squash blossom. Pueblo people weren't even mentioned at that time in that exhibit. And so you begin the exhibit, you literally walked in, and I think the first case had the squash blossom in it. And then it was just described as like silversmith, blah, 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 like very short description. And then most of the exhibit narrates the history of New Mexico through like material culture objects. So a lot of like metal, a lot of silver, but most of it was the takeaway really from that exhibit was that through Spanish colonialism, Native people were gifted metal. And then we were able to like use metal for like jewelry, and things like that. But the only representation of the technological progress that Spanish colonialism brought to Indigenous people was this random squash blossom. They didn't even know who made it, this random squash blossom that was next to some sort of other Spanish metal work thingy in that case. And so that was the narrative there. It was very much like Pueblo people don't exist, or I guess Pueblo people like don't have technology. We need to interpret technology through like the introduction of metal. And that like Navajo people, because squash blossoms are associated with Navajo people or Navajo jewelry making, right? And that's the only representation of Indigenous people at all was through an object.
Yeah.
An object that we could only do because the Spanish brought us technology because we're so primitive, right? That's basically the implication. And then the New Mexico History Museum was this really fancy, shiny progress narrative about, there were Native people, but Native people are at the beginning. It was very chronological. And then you have like the Spanish and Mexican, and then you have like the American colonialism. So you have like the atomic bomb, and then you have like cars and all of these other things. But the narrative in the New Mexico History Museum was very much one where it's like, okay, so indigenous people were here first, but they're in the past, right? And so we're advancing through a progress narrative of history to where we get to like Sandia National Labs and Intel, those kinds of things. And of course, like the spectrum of civilization that's being represented is like Native people are at the bottom as primitive and like prior to civilization, and then like the Spanish and the Mexican are like in the middle, like, you know, they brought some good things, but then like white Americans are like the pinnacle of civilization and technical innovation. And I was like, this is wow. Oh wow. And New Mexico, the GDP of New Mexico, the largest contributor to the GDP is tourism. And you have people from all over the world who come to Santa Fe specifically to, I don't know, to have their Pueblo Disneyland experience.
To consume Native culture. Yeah.
But the Native culture they're consuming is through objects. And we've talked so much about this with, you know, Pueblo folks who were out on the plaza, the Portal in downtown Santa Fe, like, and even Santa Fe Indian Market, right? Santa Fe really traffics in the objectification of indigeneity. And it's like very easy for folks, not just white folks, but people from all over the world to have their Indian experience through objects because it's very passive, right? It pacifies indigenous people. They don't like having, you know, like the Red Nation holding a protest coming down the street during Indian Market because it ruins their Pueblo Disneyland experience, right?
Yep.
And this goes back to like the exhibit that you saw, the Native Voices exhibit with the picture from the Chaco protest at the Bureau of Land Management in 2018. That wasn't passive. We took over an entire intersection at that protest. That was, people said strong words, like the largest number of petitions against any single oil and gas development in New Mexico state history was delivered that day as part of that protest. That was like a profound moment of community power and decolonization, right? Yep. It wasn't like we were making jewelry and selling it. Nope. And I'm not saying anything about our relatives who do that for a living. I'm actually not talking about that. I'm talking about how the objectification of Native people in public turns us into property that then commodifies indigeneity. And the whole point of all of that is to satisfy like settler comfort on stolen land. That's all that's about. And it silences, and it also somewhat criminalizes, you know, Indigenous people who are vocal, Indigenous women who are powerful and strong, and those of us who engage in active resistance. And that resistance happens in public. Protests and rallies happen in public. The toppling of monuments and statues happens in public. That itself is also a type of history. We're trying to push back against the whitewash narrative of history that normalizes settler colonialism and pacifies Indigenous people, and then criminalizes and silences Indigenous resistance, because that's really what it does.
Yep. And in Santa Fe in particular, like this construction of a Native American aesthetic and what it is, I look back on things like pottery, and which of course the Pueblo people are hugely famous for pottery. And yet pottery for our ancestors was utilitarian, and it was decorated because everybody likes pretty things, right? In their homes, and to use things that are decorated. But this idea, of pottery as a consumer object, as an art form, really was created by white people. And it is now, and again, nothing against potters. Like, I like pottery. I can't have too much of it in my house because I have cats. But
it's too expensive. I can't afford it.
It becomes so expensive. But all of this is done for the consumer market. Like, none of this is done for Native people. It's done by Native people for consumption by settlers. And the same thing now, with a lot of the art forms that Native people use to earn a living, which I support everybody, feeding their families and taking care of the necessities of life. But a lot of those art forms were constructed by white people. So the construction of this native aesthetic is all about white people and about their comfort and what they want to see in their house, that makes them feel like they have somehow become part of the native culture, part of the land, when actually what they're doing is just consuming on stolen land.
And you know what, the spirituality and the new age piece to that too, it allows settlers to project their own identity onto these objects, or to presume that the presence of these types of objects that they purchase through a commodity exchange in a place like Santa Fe, and to bring those into their homes, they're always like interested in the story behind the object, like, does it have a spirit? Like, is this a spirit animal? Or those kinds of things, right? They like that story because they like to own indigeneity, and they like to be proximate. They like to be close to it. And I think this also has something to do with like the ethnic fraud issue that is really coming to light, where people like to claim indigeneity, right? Because actually ethnic fraud is the objectification of indigeneity. It's the commodification into identity, like a well-packaged, easily packaged identity that then has like social and political and economic capital attached to it. So it's still just the commodification of indigeneity. It just happens through something a bit less material, meaning identity, and is more, right? So like in the realm of ontology. But I'm digressing. What I'm trying to say is that, like going back to the Native Voices exhibit and the way you were describing it, understanding like the efforts to protect Chaco Canyon as cultural or spiritual, right? Again, that kind of purchase into the objectification of Native people through some sort of spirituality that can be extracted from like the material conditions of colonialism that resource extraction actually is, and the intense violence. I mean, something I also didn't mention is that like gender and sexual violence, research proves that gender and sexual violence increases with, the violation of the land through resource extractive practices. Yep. And so what the spirituality and then also the objectification does is it like allows settlers to have many steps removed from the material conditions of colonial violence that Native people are confronting. And obviously what we do with the Red Nation is we're like, nope, like we just take the objectification and the spirituality away. And we're like, no, you have to look at colonial violence, period, because that is the reality for Native people.
Yep.
And if you're here to just have your Pueblo Disneyland experience, we're not trying to ruin it for you, but we're just simply telling you that like, this is bullshit, Yeah. And it would be really nice if you could have a sense of solidarity and interaction with Indigenous people that's about like decolonization.
Yep.
And ending this violence. I mean, the life expectancy for Native people dropped to 60 in the past decade, like 5 years even. I mean, shit's bad.
Yeah. Yep. And particularly in the Southwest, but I think also probably, I don't know specifically, but I do know in the Southwest, this is a national sacrifice zone, and the ongoing fight against not just Chaco Canyon, but also Los Alamos and the Downwinders and all of the nuclear waste that's being dumped in New Mexico, and the uranium mining across on Navajo land in Arizona. This is just a national wasteland, and the health of the people. Not only do people struggle putting food on the table and heating their homes and getting medicine, but things that they can't avoid, like breathing air and drinking water, are also killing us. It's
grotesque.
It really is. And to see how much money went into this exhibit at the Field Museum, I just wanted to cry. And the second day I was there, I did not go into that exhibit, but I did, I saw You Are on Native Land, and I just wish that I had a can of spray paint And I would have spray painted that. Although I love the urban native era hats and the shirts that say you are on native land, I would have just crossed it out and put stolen. Like that's the bottom line, is you are on stolen land. And I was telling Melanie earlier, I went on this mural tour. There's a lot of great street art in Chicago. And obviously the Chicago Art Institute, which is a college, also, not just a museum. So they have a lot of real creative people in Chicago, a lot of BIPOC. There's a great Puerto Rican neighborhood. There's the South Side of Chicago, which is famous for being the Black area. And just there's a lot of street art. We did not go to those places. We stayed in downtown Chicago, which is all white, like Chicago, oh so white. It's almost blinding in its monochromatic whiteness. But I'm on the bus with this woman, and we're going around, and we're looking at all these. So let me say something about street art too, about graffiti and about murals. That's like a rebellion, right? That taggers and graffiti people, I mean, they have a culture, and people who do murals that are not acceptable, that's also a culture. And what we were seeing was actually accepted muralists, which was bullshit. But we came on to this building, and there's a giant mural of a native man that reminded me of End of the Trail, head down, very sad looking, like this. And the guide said, and this is the last Native American in the city of Chicago. All of our tribes were forced out in the late 1800s. And I was sitting in the back, and I had my head between my knees. I was just like, I was biting my tongue not to scream. And then she said it was painted by a Frenchman. And of course it was painted by a Frenchman, because there's also two giant sculptures of native men on horseback that were done by I think they were a Swedish artist. Like, really? But when she said this is the last Native American in the city of Chicago, afterwards I went up to her and I pulled her aside and I said, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the country, and roughly 65,000 Native people live in Chicago. So number one, you're incorrect. And number two, I'm just really curious why we couldn't get a Native person to paint a giant 3-story mural. In contrast to all of those horrific experiences, I went to the DeSable Museum of African American History, and they had an amazing freaking exhibit on the Black Panthers and artifacts from the Black Panthers, and something that I had never done before, which is one of those virtual reality things with the headset, on the March on Washington. So you put this headset on, and it was like you were there marching with Martin Luther King. And of course, I got really freaked out. And I thought I was going to fall over, because it's almost like you're walking, but you're not walking. You're supposed to be standing there. But I was like, I don't know what to do. I'm going to fall apart.
I've never done any virtual reality stuff, so I'd probably fall over.
Yeah, I had never done it either. And I was dizzy and kind of like, and the guy who was in there, he was like, it's okay. It's okay. I kept hearing him. It's okay. Just stand still. And I was like, I don't know if I can. But that museum on the south side of Chicago was like, they had an art wing, and they had, and then they had this exhibit on the Black Panthers, and then they had this virtual reality thing. And it was just so well put together. But you could tell that it was run, curated, owned by Black people, because the difference between what that said to me, what was spoken in the exhibits in that museum, was like real and tangible and raw. And like, here's Martin Luther King, who is probably arguably the most famous Black American. Well, maybe Barack Obama. But we're also going to show you the Black Panthers, and an exhibit on the slave ships and enslaved Africans. It was real. And I just got so sad thinking that what they do to us with our permission,
Yeah.
with the people who co-curated that, like with our permission, this is what's done to us. Whereas the Black folks in the South Side of Chicago are like, fuck no, we're doing this. This is our museum.
I wonder, so I'm a little, I don't travel as much as I used to. And I actually can't remember the last time I was at a Native owned and run museum. It's been a long time since I've been to the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., for example. The reason why I'm saying this is that I feel like I just wish that Native people would embrace the history of resistance and like power the way that our Black relatives do in that museum that you went into in Chicago, right? Because I wish those kinds of spaces in institutions like existed where we don't cater to white settler audiences, where we're not just performing culture and spirituality for white settler audiences, where we are celebrating, Tewa Women United and the Red Nation and, these profound acts of decolonization and anti-colonial resistance unapologetically. And we're not trying to cloak them in the language, right, of culture and spirituality to make people more comfortable. Like, I just wish we celebrated our history of resistance more often, because in New Mexico, pretty much, I mean, there are people who support the, the toppling of the obelisk in Santa Fe or the taking down of the Oñate statues in Albuquerque or up in Alcalde, which is in northern New Mexico. People support that, but also they don't. They distance themselves from those of us who are there on the ground engaged in that work because they don't want to be perceived as criminals. They don't want to be perceived or associated as bad Indians or associated with the so-called bad Indians, because the economy, the economy of settler common sense in a place like New Mexico is one where you are expected as a Native person in public to behave. You are expected to be passive. You are expected to perform culture and authenticity for people
to
produce that
for white consumption.
For white consumption. The economy quite literally depends on it, the financial economy, but so does the discursive and, like I said, the economy of common sense in New Mexico. And so when you violate that, when you are an Indian in public who is poor or unsheltered, when you are an Indian in public who is protesting, when you are a Native woman in public who is screaming because you're so tired of, women disappearing and getting sex trafficked, right? You're just so sick of the violence. It's very easy for our own people, and everyone else, to vilify us as the bad Indians. And then somehow, right, there's a division then that's created between the good Indians and the bad Indians. And it's just bullshit. And it's just bullshit.
And I think, that passivity too, that's always been really horrific to me, that, and I don't know so much with Dene women people, but, Pueblo women people are expected to be passive and quiet. And of course, some communities more than others, some of the more conservative communities, you're literally brought up to not talk outside your family or outside your community about anything. And, even the simplest of questions, have you planted corn, this year, can be met with just stone silence. And it's we are raised to accept our fates and not confront it or not fight for change, because that's the role of our leaders, the men. And seeing the younger women in the Red Nation gives me hope for the future, because I didn't have any when I was a kid. We never no one ever told us that we could speak up and say this is bullshit. And now people are saying it, but that passivity and that just, we're being told that's part of our culture.
Right. And it has like, it's always gendered. It's always gendered too. And, I can't like, disclose full details for possible legal reasons, but I recently faced a situation where I did not get an opportunity to work in my own homelands because I'm a feminist. And right, and that the notion of tradition or like culture was invoked to kind of like gatekeep, saying right that feminism isn't traditional for Dene people, and that equation or that logic right there. Not only is that like these were men, by the way, who said this and were doing the gatekeeping, so they're just being misogynists. They're just being misogynists. But that invocation of tradition and culture, or sometimes spirituality, to like to discipline and to contain, and to silence, especially women and like young people. I would say this also happens a lot to LGBTQ2 people in our communities. Our people do it, but also like the institutions of power, like museums in a place like New Mexico, certainly operate according to this very colonial common sense of discipline and containment and silencing. And so it's very, it's very prevalent and it's very consistent, obviously, with kind of like the larger structure of settler colonialism. But I would really just encourage, especially like Native women or like working class Native people who are listening to this, don't just shatter that. Just break right through that. Don't be contained. Don't be silenced. Like, fuck that. Really, like there's too much. There's too much at stake. There's too much at stake.
Our ancestors were never contained. I mean, that wasn't part of there was no strict gender codes, who could speak up, who could get angry, who could yell, who could suggest change. I mean, that's all colonially imposed, and particularly the gender roles in the binary that didn't exist prior to settler colonialism. So fuck it, just stand up, scream,
just speak the truth.
Yeah,
speak the truth and like fight for our future and fight for the dignity of our people. Like, God,
yeah,
that's all that Indigenous feminists do. Seriously, all that we do is we're just like, hey, this violence is messed up and it's like really strong, so we should address this. And then all we do is like support our people and try to create the conditions for Indigenous people to thrive and Indigenous nations to thrive in the future and to like caretake the earth. It's literally all we do. Yeah. And yet, right, that is so threatening to heteropatriarchy, and other powers that be. But yeah, actually, that is oftentimes, I think, being in public as like a Native woman in the Red Nation, and I know you've experienced this a lot in Santa Fe, you're basically labeled as a threat.
Yep.
Or like there are a lot of different synonyms for what it means to be a threat. And you're labeled as that by many different kinds of people. Men, other Native people, white folks, Hispanos.
And particularly, with Native men, they're, they try to control and gatekeep their own power within their communities by keeping women down. And you can't say that. You don't speak for your tribe. You're not, an official. Well, I can speak for whoever the hell I want to. Just because I don't have a title next to my name does not mean that I don't have a voice in this world. And it's really sad that seems to keep people down, and not amongst relatives and family. There's more shit talk in the kitchens in the pueblos than I've ever heard in my life. But sometimes it doesn't go outside. It stays within the community and
It's contained.
it's contained.
Yeah. And I don't know, you know, we've often been labeled as like violent, like the bad Indians, right? Or like the synonyms for bad as like violent or threatening. I mean, obviously that's not true. But the reason, right, that we're labeled as violent is because we refuse. I think we just refuse the order of things. We refuse to perform what is expected of us by all of these really violent structures and institutions of power, whether it's heteropatriarchy or like settler colonialism or white supremacy. And I've had to get used to making people feel very uncomfortable by just being myself.
Yeah.
And I know that you have to, especially in public. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting it's an interesting journey.
It really is. And it's exhausting too.
It is.
It's
scary sometimes.
It is. We're going to have a podcast on a book we've been talking about before we started. And I find going out in bougie Santa Fe literally exhausting. And it just drains my energy because you have Native people performing, and then you have really ignorant, entitled settlers asking stupid ass questions that all have to do with spirituality or production of art for the settler market. And if you speak out, you're automatically the bad Indian, just like you said. And if you don't speak out because you're just too fucking exhausted and you don't understand, like you look around, and I feel like, that bar in Star Wars, in the first Star Wars movie, and you walk in and there's just like all these aliens around and the music is pretty good. So you're kind of like, yeah, da, 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 da. And then you look around and you're like, who the fuck are these people? Like, that's the way I feel in Santa Fe. And I'm like, damn, I don't want to be around these people. I got to get out of here before someone shoots me. And that's literally the way I think a lot of us feel in these border towns is, so I went to a talk yesterday and I was surrounded by Native people, relatives, friends, and I felt like I had, there was a group of people that were there and had my back, and I could have, stood up and said something when I didn't like what I was hearing, but I just was too tired. I was like, I don't want to engage, because engaging as a feminist, as a Marxist, as anti-colonialist, as all of these things, that we are, what the reaction is going to be. And sometimes it's just not worth it. Like, if it was something where we were protesting, or it was an action, hell yeah, I'd be the first one there with the loudest voice. But being in this town with all those bougie, rich white people, I'm like, fuck, I don't want to talk to them. I'm not going to waste my energy with them.
Yeah, it's
exhausting.
No, so it's exhausting to like have encounters. I think we're mostly talking about kind of like liberals or progressives, like people on the liberal spectrum. But then it's just downright dangerous when you're talking about people on the right. They'll just shoot you or they'll like, try to get you in prison and stuff like that. So it's exhausting, but it's also dangerous. And I don't know. I've been thinking about that a lot. I mean, this podcast is public. Anyone can listen to this podcast. And I said this maybe about a month ago when we were doing a podcast, and I was talking about the Nashville shooting that happened a month and a half ago. And, it's I think we're just in this, I don't know why I'm going here, but where we can wrap up soon. We're in a hyper reactionary moment. And I feel like the work that we do and who we are, and not just our politics, but it's like, how we've developed into who we are over the last decade of struggle, mostly me through the Red Nation. uh, the political circumstances and the material conditions have shifted dramatically. I would say even in the last couple of years, where there are, from what I can tell, actually more dire repercussions now for being us, for being a feminist, right, for being a Marxist or a socialist, for being anti-colonial, for being indigenous. Like there are real repercussions right now because of the authoritarian like reactionary backlash that is raining down on us, and the imperial decline, I would say, of the United States. And I feel like it's like whatever that is, it's the squeeze, it's like it's tightening, like it's getting tighter. And the only area of relief is like through kind of facile empty representation and like the diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of stuff, the very hyper liberal stuff, which also just evacuates actual histories of resistance of any meaning. It takes the teeth out of things. And so it's hard not to be scared in a moment like this, where you are like the person who's being labeled as certain things, and there are real repercussions, like you won't get a job, or like I can't return to my homelands,
Yeah.
because there are men who are like literally trying to block my return home. And I'm like, like this is a place where I belong. Like I know where my belly button belongs, as a Dene person. And so people are going to prison. We've been talking about this, getting charged with domestic terrorism. And so it's like I don't know exactly what I'm saying. We're just living through it. And so I think about it all the time. And yet we have to maintain, we can't not be who we are. We can't not tell the truth.
Yeah, it's functional denial. I mean, you have to be able to get through your life on a day-to-day basis. And so, we block out a lot of these things that we see comrades get shot or threatened, and
Yeah.
it's horrible, it's horrific, and you think, this was a clear case of, attempted murder, and the momentum is with us for a while, and then the months go by and you find out that these people are going to get off scot-free.
Yeah. And these are scary people.
And that's the system. Like, that's the way it works if you're us. Like, I don't think about that when I go out to the grocery store. I don't think about that, when I feel the need to speak up against something. My first reaction isn't, oh, what am I going to say that won't get me shot? My first reaction is what needs to be said. But then in the dark hours, when you wake up in the middle of the night and you start confronting those demons, and it can get really scary.
Yeah. And yeah.
And if you're trying, I like, if you're trying, I don't know, academia is so fucked.
Yeah.
But I think like Vine Deloria was an academic. I think about all these people in the past, and like there were good times. I mean, there were times when you could be a radical academic. And it's not now.
I don't think it is now.
Nope.
It actually was not too long ago. Like, I think part of the very rapid, what's the word? Like, part of the reason I think the Red Nation grew is because there was a political climate where, not necessarily being radical, but doing this kind of work, there was a place for it. There was a need. There was a hunger for it. And I'm not saying the work was rewarded. It's always been really difficult to do this work, but it was like your friends who were surrounding you when you went to this talk in Santa Fe. It wasn't just you. It was like thousands of people with you, right? And then there was like safety because you were all doing it together. And I swear that has dwindled. Like right now it's dwindled. There's more alienation, but it's also like, and it was like the light got turned on and like everyone's scattered. because, like because of that squeeze, the squeeze is getting more intense. Like books are getting banned, like teachers are being attacked, like people are getting shot every day just doing, going to the grocery store, like driving down the street. And so it's a difficult time. And I don't, it's hard to think about like where that solidarity is, and where the safety is, I think. In it's kind of like it's hard not to feel alone, because if that's what they want you to feel. They want you to feel alone, and that they've taken away, I don't know, like the sense of solidarity. But
Yeah.
and that has also, at the same time, that has actually happened, I think, to a certain extent. And so it's yeah, this is, I think you said, during that episode, like this is what fascism, or like the turn to fascism is like.
Yep.
It's like ever since then I've just been oh, just been stewing on that.
Yeah. And it's, I mean,
They're coming for you.
and we're not even talking about when fascism gets here. Fascism is here.
Yeah.
Fascism is here, and it's just how much faster it's going to grow.
I mean, Trump is trying to get reelected.
Yeah, I can't even. I mean, God. But I didn't believe it would happen the first time. So
I didn't think that Roe v. Wade would ever be overturned. Like, I didn't think that people would be like outlawing drag shows. Like this is seriously crazy. This is scary hours. And I didn't mean to take us to a dark place, but really it's like it really is a real thing.
when gay marriage was upheld by the Supreme Court, it was almost like, yeah, it's about damn time, and glad that it happened. And the fact that and the overturning of Roe v. Wade happened in such a short period of time, like the time that this country turned on a dime and went from this, liberalism, pseudo-liberalism, and then to fascism so quickly. It's almost like, I think I had whiplash.
And then it happened during COVID, like during the height of the pandemic. And it's like, what? Like, we're experiencing like a profound shift for humanity. But in the United States, there's a profound shift happening in the US, and it's wild. It's wild. I don't think about it every single day. Like I try to just live my life, but when I'm in public, I can't not think about it.
You can't. I mean, and I used to really enjoy traveling. I mean, I can be amused by the stupidest things. Like I'm pretty easy to amuse. I go to museums, and even though I'm, shaking my head and like wanting to bang it against the wall with some of the native stuff, I like to go look at rocks, and I like to, to look at art and whatever. But I find myself now overhearing things that people are saying, or listening to docents at museums, and listening to people talking, and just feeling supremely uncomfortable and out of place. Like an alien. Like, I don't know what their life experience is, but it's definitely not mine. And what they seem to want in life, and I'm using they like settlers, white people, what they seem to want in life, or what they're holding up as important. Like, it kind of blows my mind to hear people talking about, well, in the next century. And I'm thinking, oh, honey, we ain't going to be around in the next century. Like, what the hell are you talking about? You're here, consuming and buying and not thinking about your footprint in this world. And you're talking about something, in the next century. Like, we don't do something right now, decolonization or extinction. So stop talking about like taking a cruise around the world and blah. Yeah.
It's yeah, it's really disturbing. Yeah, feeling like an alien. So making people uncomfortable, but then also, and then if you speak up, you make people really uncomfortable, or you risk violence, someone getting violent towards you. Because it's very acceptable now these days to be violent against women or people of
Yeah.
color or like anyone else in public. It's very acceptable to be like a white supremacist in public again in the United States. And so, or like openly transphobic and homophobic. Um, and so you do risk, violence as well. But yeah, that feeling of like, I am not like these. One thing is not like the other in this situation. And so it, when you're alone, that is how it feels. But I feel like an organization like the Red Nation, we've gone through our struggles, but when you're amongst your comrades, you're just like, oh, this feeling. It's this feeling of like, I can open up. I don't have to be so tense. And
Yep.
I can just be myself in the fullest sense of the word. And when we're together, like that sense that we can still do this, right? We can still be ourselves. We can still be powerful and strong, even though, like, when you step out that door, it is not good. Like, shit is bad. Like,
Yeah.
there's still a commitment, a renewed commitment, to continuing to do this work, even though the stakes are really high, and even though, quite frankly, it's downright dangerous right now.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, it's more acceptable to be a white supremacist than it is to be a feminist indigenous person, which that's pretty sick.
Yeah, it is pretty sick. But can't be nihilistic, right? We can't give up. We can't just become individualistic. We can't just be about protecting our own. Like, can't do that. So we got to keep doing the things we're doing. Got to
That's
keep
right.
being indigenous. Got to keep bringing communities together. Got to keep taking care of the earth, and got to keep speaking the truth. So, yep. So hopefully we do that on this podcast. I think we do.
Yes, I definitely think we do. And just a shout out, yesterday while I was standing in line at this event I went to, I had a man come up to me and asked me if I was Elena, and I said yes. And he said that he watches our podcast all the time, and I was so thrilled because that's the first time that ever happened to me. So just a shout out. You made my day. I appreciate it.
Mm.
Sometimes we're in this virtual world so much that, just seeing someone in person is kind of intimidating. But
yeah. Aw.
oh my God, a human being is talking to me. Like, not through a screen. What do I say? It's kind of funny.
God, what a wild time to be alive. I'm sure every generation says that, but good grief.
Yep.
What a time to still believe in revolution. Good God. Yeah. Well, that's exciting. Aw.
It was fun. And yeah, I definitely think we're up for another book review. Okay. Also, at some point this summer, we're gonna have to review Killers of the Flower Moon.
Ooh, I'm writing it down right now.
Because people keep asking me about it. And so Martin Scorsese, okay. Leonardo DiCaprio, okay. But I read something last night. It premiered at Cannes.
Oh, it's a movie.
Yeah, it's a movie. And Lily Gladstone, who's the indigenous female star, got a longer standing ovation than Scorsese.
What? Wow. So
don't know too much about it other than it's based around the Osage Nation in Oklahoma, and
I've heard of it. Okay, I've heard of this.
The land allotments, which all of a sudden were discovered to have oil, and So white dudes are talking about horrific. White dudes are marrying Native women to steal all their money.
Right. To gain access to the wealth. Yeah.
Yeah, and kill them, which is like, geez, that's still going on. Not necessarily for the same reason, but and so Martin Scorsese directed it. Leonardo DiCaprio is the name, but it's got, of course, the fantastic and wonderful Tantu Cardinal is in it.
Oh.
And then Lily Gladstone is, I think, the native lead. And apparently she's just fabulous. They mentioned her for possible awards, which would be amazing. I don't know if we're going to like the movie or not, but you're probably going to get a real honest response.
All right.
And it's 3.5 hours.
Ugh, the things, the time commitment for Red Power Hour episodes. It's okay. All right, cool. Killers of the Flower Moon. That'll be coming this summer. We're going to be doing more book reviews on a regular basis. Hopefully we'll be doing fiction, maybe some political books and other things. And current events as they unfold. But yeah, I think maybe we'll be doing more. I think we should still, oh God, I purchased Yellowstone on Amazon, but I can't bring myself to what I gotta, but we need to do it. We need to review Yellowstone.
And this is the last season.
5 seasons. Okay. Well,
because apparently Taylor Sheridan is going on to bigger and better things. I don't know. He's got another Yellowstone.
Please don't.
Another. Yeah, I know. Another one I have to watch. He's got another coming out because Kevin Costner's bailing. So Matthew McConaughey, who I also hate, like. He seems to hire actors that I loathe and despise, which is fine.
There's also that Western, that show with Emily Blunt in it that one of our patrons recommended to us.
The English?
Oh, it's called The English. Okay.
Yeah. I watched it.
Oh, I have not watched it yet.
It's interesting.
Okay.
Now I have to think more about it because I remember having a lot of thoughts when I watched it, but it's been a while. It's interesting.
Okay. Well, I know we're just like ending this podcast episode with talking about all the work we have to do, but this is what you can look forward to this summer. Yeah. Just a lot of reviews of the things that we've been talking about for a long time, but haven't done. And that's that. Anything else, Elena?
Nope, I think that's it.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening and apparently watching. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
And if you don't watch, we have YouTube. Every time we record, we also record videos that go up on the Red Nation's YouTube channel. You should check it out. I've also had other people tell me that sometimes they play the videos of our podcast because it helps them to not feel so alone when they're in their house, which is like, I'm so sorry people feel alienated. We were literally just talking about feeling alienated, and I don't know. I'm glad that maybe just having our faces on a screen in the background, because that's the kind of community you need to keep that optimism going, that revolutionary optimism. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks.